It's Amanda here in Italy, as usual, Sunday night, and I'm in Italy. I don't know where you are, but what are we talking about tonight? We're talking about buying property in Italy and renting it out on Airbnb. And particularly, we're covering the new law on Airbnb and lockboxes, which many people use as a way to let their tenants or their short-term tenants or their guests, whatever you want to call them, into the apartment without having to wait and check and see them in. Okay, so great. So I've been asked to do this post quite a lot. I made a previous video on the taxes on Airbnb and the new laws on Airbnb in Italy and what it means for property owners. And I'll link that up there, but I'll also put it in the description box as I always do. So great. If you're joining us for the first time, my name's Amanda. We cover all things to do with relocating to Europe, particularly Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, the countries I work the most of, and particularly owning property here in Italy, the laws in Italy, and what it is to own property here. So great. So tonight is no exception. When you come in, won't you do me a favor and go down to the description box and just tell us your city? Yes, tonight we're going to get into all the details of what it is to run an Airbnb in Italy, to stay in Airbnb in Italy, to buy property in Italy in 2025. We're already in 2025. As I say, if you're joining for the first time, my name's Amanda. Let's get into it. Okay. So what is a lockbox and why should we know about it? So that is a lockbox. Let me show you. That is a lockbox. And lockboxes have always been, in the last, let's say, 5 years, been put on the outside of buildings. They have a code on them, just like a suitcase lock, and it's kind of a combination code. And they were implemented because what happened was when Airbnb took off 15 years ago, everybody who had a spare room or had some way to host a guest was on Airbnb. It was unregulated. It was new. The hotels didn't pay any attention to it because they didn't think it would ever be a threat. Anyway, we all know the history of Airbnb. Which one of us hasn't stayed in an Airbnb? Anyway, fast forward to, let's say, 2017 was the first time that in Italy, particularly, a law which existed in 2017 about taxing those who were Airbnb hosts who were not having tax withheld by Airbnb from them. That started a whole big court case, but I'll cover that later. Let's first start with the lockbox. So that was the first little sign that there was going to be a problem for lots of people who buy investment properties in Italy, and not only Italy, by the way, France and Portugal has implemented similar stuff to combat mass tourism. Why? Because it makes the rents climb up, because people realize, owners of properties, people who buy investment properties, realize they don't really want to have a long-term guest in their home, in their house, in their apartment. What they really want to do is just hire it out every 2 weeks to an Airbnb guest. Well, initially they would have to have a cleaner or, let's say, a manager who welcomed the guests, signed them in, made sure everything was hunky-dory, told them all the rules, and then maybe lived nearby and went away. And then, of course, more and more people got into this game of running Airbnbs. I've had friends who've had 10 or 20 Airbnbs in London. I've had friends in Italy in the past who were renting an apartment in Milan in a good area. And even though they were renting and had no right whatsoever, they let this out on Airbnb and they got away with it for years. Anyway, those were the heydays. No longer. So in 2017, as I mentioned, there was a big court case. Airbnb is headquartered in Ireland. It's the EU, so yes. So for tax purposes, they're an island. And the Italian state um, tax receiver, what we call the Agenzia Entrate, presented them with an enormous bill for a couple of billion euros, saying you should have been withholding 21% withholding tax on every one of these transactions. So why weren't you? But we'll cover that. I'm going to read you an article about that. But the lockbox thing has just come into being. Why is it a problem? I tell you why this probably came about. Okay. So what happens? You book a trip, you find a lovely apartment in Sicily or wherever in Italy, in Tuscany, maybe in a little village, and you book it all from the States or Australia or wherever you're coming from, somewhere else in Europe. And now you start worrying because you know there might be delayed flights. And remember, during the COVID period, and even soon after the COVID period, it was very difficult to know when your flight was going to arrive. Anyway, but now you didn't have to worry, because before somebody had to wait there for you, check you in, make sure everything was going well. No. Now you could just simply find the lockbox outside, and in that lockbox, there's a little container where there's a key inside. So you put the code in, you got the key, you opened the door, you went in, and hunky-dory. And now you had everything. And you didn't need anyone to meet you, and it could be in the middle of the night, could be at 3 o'clock in the morning, could be any time. And it relieved the owner of the responsibility of having to check you in, of having to have somebody wait there until you arrive to check you in. Hello, Sarah. Lovely to see you again. Haven't seen you for a while, from Sydney in Australia. So basically, this system, which most people have used sometime, I just stayed in a Airbnb in France recently over Christmas, and there was a lockbox. The owner was in some other city, and in fact, it was a problem for me. I couldn't get into the lockbox because, I didn't have Wi-Fi. My phone freaked out, and my Italian service wouldn't allow me into my Wi-Fi, so I couldn't get the code. And I was standing outside in the street in the rain, trying to find this code. Anyway, long story short, somebody eventually patched me into their Wi-Fi, and I got the code, and finally we got in quite late. I had an interview to do. It was quite dramatic. But anyway, so this system is now all over Europe, and Italy passed a law, and I'm going to read you the article about it, and we'll cover each thing as it comes up. Okay, so the lockbox with its little code is on the outside of the building, and you simply put the code in and then take the key, and Bob is your uncle. So let's read this for you, okay? So Rome, this is CNN, this is reporting on. The days of arriving late at an Airbnb in Italy and opening up the key box to let yourself in will soon be over after the country issued a ban on self-check-ins. So you can't check in by yourself anymore. Under a new law, it says it's needed to combat mass tourism. In a move welcomed, also terrorism. Sorry, I read tourism. In a move welcomed by those fearing that the popular travel destination is in danger of being overwhelmed by tourists. It's always been since I've lived here for 20 years. Law enforcement officers are to be deployed to ensure the removal of key boxes and keypads on self-check-in properties all over Italy, and this is happening as we speak. The ban represents a tightening up of Italian law. All renters, no matter what the duration of occupancy, must be registered at local police stations. This, by the way, this law has existed ever since I know, and probably for the last 50 years. If you had a guest, many people didn't adhere to, but it's always existed. If you had a guest staying with you, even somebody in your home, you were obliged, and always have been ever since I've known, to go to the police station and to register them as your guest. I'm just going to have to plug in a battery here. Give me a minute. Don't go off. Don't go off, please. That should be okay. Is the battery working? I hope so. Okay, so basically, you were obliged and always have been under Italian law to register any guests you had. These include guests in your home. Many people didn't do this, they didn't bother to do it, but it is law. And you're in deep trouble, and I've covered this before, by the way. If something happens, let's say you let a friend or, I don't know, some guest, an Airbnb guest that's unofficial, in your apartment, and something happens in the night, the police are called. They could get violently ill, somebody could be attacked, I don't know, robbery could happen. The police will arrive, and you should have registered those guests. So now you're against the law, because basically you have unregistered guests residing in your home. This has always been the law in Italy. So let's go back to this. Okay. But in recent years, property managers have been forwarding photocopies of cell phone pics to a messaging service to comply with this need to register your guests. Now they have to make physical checks in person. The new regulation is needed to implement stringent measures aimed at preventing risks to public order and safety in relation to the possible accommodation of dangerous people. This has always been the case. It was also a way in the past to control the mafia. You could stay wherever they like. Because in a hotel, you have to register with a document in relation to the possible accommodation of dangerous people and those linked to criminal or terrorist organizations, according to the circular announcing the ban. This comes as the city of Rome braces itself, you've probably heard about this, for an onslaught of tourists for the Vatican's Holy Jubilee year in 2025, and Italy hosts the Winter Olympics in Cortina in 2026. So a mass of tourists are coming for the Jubilee, coming to the Vatican, coming to St. Peter's, coming to Rome. Both events during which Airbnbs and other short-term rentals have already been booked. Okay. Italian city Florence bans key boxes. They already did that, but now it's a countrywide ban. And tour guide loudspeakers to tackle over tourism. So if you've ever walked about Florence, there's people with these loud hailers now shouting at their group to keep them in control, and it just becomes unpleasant for anybody. So Italy's had to make these decisions. Okay, the decision to enact the ban was made in light of the intensification of the phenomenon of short-term rentals in Italy throughout the country, linked to the numerous political, cultural, and religious events scheduled in the country. Also in view of the Jubilee celebrations, but quite frankly, this has been happening for some time. The Jubilee celebrations will bring an estimated 30 to 35 million tourists to Italy. That's a lot of people. It's more than half the population of Italy. Local governments have already welcomed the move, which comes on the heels of a ban on key boxes issued by the Tuscan city of Florence in mid-November. The mayor of Rome, Roberto Gualtieri, told CNN he applauded the ban, saying padlocks and key boxes disfigure our streets, and they're ugly, and it's good news for everybody that they'll be done away with. I express my appreciation for a decision that I have been hoping for some time, which clarifies and guarantees better prevention of abuse by people who run accommodation illegally. Okay, and also puts an initial break on unfair competition for hotels and for Airbnbs that are legally registered. I'll get to that just now. I'm going to read you those laws. Italy's tourism minister, Daniela Santanchè, called the ban an essential step to prevent risks and guarantee a peaceful and positive tourist experience. In a statement to CNN, Airbnb said it took security seriously and supported official efforts to crack down on illegal key boxes in public spaces. I'm quite sure Airbnb aren't happy about this, but anyway, whatever. But it defended self-check-ins as a convenient option for both hosts and guests to manage arrivals in a way. While we remain committed to promoting responsible hosting and ensuring that our platform continues to offer safe and enjoyable experiences for everyone. This is Airbnb. And Airbnb have really, had their tail on fire. They had so many years where they were making money hand over glove, and now they've got their tail on fire. Okay, so that's what Airbnb said, and so that's that. Okay, so great. So what is this going to change? Well, it's going to change a few things. And who does it really concern? The most important thing is, who does this really concern? I'll tell you who it concerns. It concerns people who buy a property in Italy. They can't be there either because they plan on retiring later, but they've bought into a property, so they've got an apartment in Sicily or Tuscany or up in Como in the north, and they can't be there. They come once a year, but in the meantime, they're renting it out on Airbnb. So what happens is they've got a lockbox, and instead of having a manager to manage it and everybody having to sign in, which is expensive and costly and takes away some of the profits, I would think a large part of the profits, what they do is they have the lockbox. So the cleaner comes in, she uses the lockbox, she cleans up the apartment between people, she goes away, and nothing else is needed. The Wi-Fi is there, and everything else can be done remotely. Other than cleaning the place up and getting it ready for the next one, nobody has to wait to welcome them because they get the key out of the lockbox and they're in and everything's fine. And then when they leave the key again in the lockbox. Okay. Well, so that's been happening for years. And recently, it's almost the norm. I remember I've stayed in Airbnbs all over Europe in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years. And that wasn't the case initially, that a lockbox was used. Somebody met you and, you usually tried to tell them what time you thought you might arrive. They would ask you. But not only for Airbnb, also for booking, the same thing, because you can have booking.com, you can also book online. But I'm going to now tell you where the woes of Airbnb started, and who, as I mentioned, who does this affect? I mean, who are the people who own these Airbnbs? Which kind of people use Airbnb? I'm going to tell you. So anybody who owns investment properties in Italy and doesn't want to leave them standing has them on Airbnb. People who have got no limitations on to when they can be in Italy, but they don't particularly want to live full-time in Italy right now. In other words, they could have Italian citizenship and they could be living anywhere in the world and just coming to Italy for 2 months or 3 months and enjoying a holiday, but in the meantime, they don't really want the place standing empty, so they put it on Airbnb and they put a lockbox. Those kind of people. Also, people who are thinking of buying a property in 2025 or bought property in the last 5 years in Italy and want to get some kind of return on it. They can't be there full time. They didn't plan on being there full time, or they're waiting to get a visa and hoping that they can be there on some kind of permanent residence for an elective visa for retirement. But in the meantime, they're hiring out their apartment, so it's not just dead, okay? And then the kind of people who are calculating what they will do when they eventually retire and eventually come to Italy, and eventually perhaps want to go home 3 times a year to America or Australia or South Africa or wherever, and don't want the place to be sitting. And they now realize, okay, I could just hire it out, put a lockbox on it. All my neighbors are doing it. When I come to Italy and I meet my neighbors, they're all doing it. All my friends in the States are doing it. So these are the kind of people who would operate an Airbnb with a lockbox. And it doesn't necessarily only need to be Airbnb. It could be Booking, by the way, booking.com. But the alternative are Airbnbs in Italy who have legally been run as Airbnbs. They are registered as Airbnbs. They pay a lot of tax to the Italian government. So this is always a tax issue. It always comes back to tax when it comes to property and when it comes to this kind of legislation. Doesn't matter the country. We're talking about Europe, we're talking about Italy, but it could be any country. So let's get back to the taxability thing. So in 2017, a law was enacted in Italy about the withholding tax that I spoke about. So Airbnb should have been, they weren't, but they should have been withholding 21% of withholding tax from everybody who booked via them. This amounts to billions. They hadn't withheld this tax. They were due to pay this tax, and obviously they didn't want to pay this tax. But this is what happened, and I'm now going to read you to refresh. I've done another post on this. I'll hook it up there and also in the description box. And what I will also put in the description box, if you're watching this back later and you really want to know, and it's important to you to know this, I will actually put the law, the actual article of the law about Italian tax on Airbnbs. And so you'll be able to cover that. Let me see what's being said here. Standing under the rain with no Wi-Fi. Exactly my experience recently in Italy with a lockbox. I was livid. Okay, well, the lockbox would have solved that, but no, because you need Wi-Fi to get the code. Okay, Airbnb in Australia works marvelously, but in Italy, I found it complicated and stressful for the traveler. I'm glad they're removing lockboxes, so these real estate vultures have to work harder. Yeah, well, that's the deal. So let's go back to the Airbnb taxes. I don't know what you can see there. Can you see Airbnb taxes there? Yeah, okay. So, Airbnb's tax problems. Okay, according to the agreement between Airbnb and the Agenzia Entrate, which is the Italian Fiscal Bureau, Airbnb must pay 576 million, 621 million US dollars to the Italian tax authorities. The amount was calculated on the estimate of the tax base, where the company should have applied a 21% withholding tax on all the bookings they made. Let's just do a quick summary. 2017, Italian law establishes that the web platform has the obligation to withhold 21% to pay over to the Italian government. And 2017 to 2021, Airbnb didn't act as a tax withholding agent, didn't collect the tax, didn't withhold the tax, and therefore didn't pay it to the Italian government. Naughty, naughty. 2022, December, the European Court of Justice said that Airbnb must pay the tax to the Italian government and must act as a withholding agent for the tax. This was taken all the way to the European Court, by the way. 2023, November, the Italian Finance Police confiscated 779 million euro. We're going to look at both sides here. The host, the owner of the Airbnb, the owner of the apartment, and also Airbnb, because there's two parties involved here with tax. And both of them are liable for tax. And this is where it comes down to being an owner in Italy and the tax that you are liable to pay. It's very difficult to dodge tax, and people have been. But I'm just covering this. 2023, December, an agreement was reached between Airbnb and the Italian Fiscal Bureau about what they had to pay. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of this. In November 2023, the Finance Police confiscated 779 million euros or 840 million US dollars from Airbnb after it allegedly failed to pay the withholding tax on all its bookings. So just for Italy. Of rental revenue, according to the statement. The tax investigators started after a fiscal check on the 3rd of May 2022 into the tax that had been supposedly withheld from 2017 to 2020. Okay, so they had this obligation. So it went to the judge, and the judge said, no, Airbnb has to pay it over. Okay, right. But here's another issue. So Airbnb has now had its fingers wrapped for tax. It now has to pay withholding tax. So that affects every single person booking. So if I'm now booking an apartment in Italy, I am obliged to pay 21% withholding tax, which Airbnb collects from me and then pays to the Italian government. You may not see it. I haven't booked an Airbnb for a while. I usually use booking.com. But these days, I used to use Airbnb much more. You may not see it directly. You can tell me, any of you who watch this, you can leave a comment for me. But if you're the owner, I don't know, you can let me know if you do actually see if this 21% withholding tax is shown on your statement. I imagine it must be. And so that's the deal. But here's the other thing. That means it's a little bit more expensive. They're going to put their prices up because obviously they've now got to cover that 21% that they wasn't being withheld from them, which is now being withheld from them. And so there's that deal. So it's going to be a little bit more expensive for everybody to rent an Airbnb or a booking, whatever, whichever one. But there's another level to this. And that is, as I mentioned to you, many of my friends in Milan and all over Italy, in Tuscany, down in Sicily, some of them were actually renting apartments on a lease from somebody that they should have been living in. But in fact, they were then hiring them out on Airbnb illegally and collecting the money, and they got away with it for years. Okay. But this law has always existed. Perhaps it has never been policed very well, and now is being, because the Italian government needs this tax. Every year, less and less tax is paid into the Italian coffers because less and less people are working and more people are on pension. And so now they are investigating everybody who has a suspected bed and breakfast that is not registered. And how do they do this? So there is something called a CIN number, and the CIN number is issued by the Italian government. It's your tax registration for your business, for this Airbnb. So it doesn't matter whether you do the bookings via your own website, whether you do actually use Airbnb to book for you, you do use booking.com, it matters not, or whether you actually take people off the street. I don't know. The point is that if you are a bed and breakfast in Italy, just like a hotel, you are obliged to register, and therefore you're obliged to pay taxes on whatever revenue you make. So Airbnb was a way to circumvent this for many people for many years. But recently, people have been cracking, the Agency Entrate, the fiscal Italian police, have been cracking down on people who just never bothered to register. And so now, if you're running an Airbnb in your own property or in a property that you rent or whatever, you're in great danger of being picked up by the Italian police, and by paying an enormous fine and having to surrender all the revenue, pay back all the revenue you've made, because you're running an illegal hotel, actually. And so this is what happened to a dear friend last month. They have an Airbnb up in Aosta in the mountains. And out of the blue, one day she was at home doing all her paperwork, and she saw in the garden two men. They weren't dressed in police clothes. They were just normal men in normal clothes. Come to find out, they were actually from the fiscal police in Italy, and they were plain clothes, and they just literally turned up. They obviously heard in the village, because you can go to a bar and ask anyone, where's the Airbnb, and of course the police know everything. Certainly in Italy they do. They can find out very quickly. And they turned up and they started interrogating her. Where is your CIN number? Where's all your tax records for this Airbnb that you're running? And she had literally 1 month before, because she had had a discussion with other friends of hers who run an Airbnb, and she went and registered for her CIN number, which was no simple task. Like most bureaucracy in Italy, it's complicated. But she had just got the CIN number, thank goodness. Otherwise, they would have literally closed her down, because she would have had to surrender all the revenue that she'd had in the 10 years she's been going, and she would have had a massive fine. Anyway, she was sweating and she was stressful. They went through it all with her. They weren't convinced that she was paying the right amount of tax on her annual thing. But anyway, she submitted it all to them, and they're in the process of. But thank God she had got her CIN number. So people who've been running illegal, and I say illegal not to be pedantic here, but it is literally illegal. You couldn't run an illegal Airbnb. You couldn't run an illegal bed and breakfast in most countries. Certainly not in America or most countries. You have, if you're hosting guests, you have to have fire safety precautions. You have to have all sorts of things. Now, Airbnb circumvented this because they sort of left it up to the host, and the hosts were all in competition with each other to present the nicest guest experience, and it was all done on reviews and referrals and points systems, and it was all lovely. But there were many unscrupulous Airbnb hosts, and there were many terrible guests who wiped out people's homes, destroyed their homes, and the insurance that is built in never really covered anything. So I'm telling you this, if you're one of these categories of people who are thinking we can buy a home in Italy when we eventually come to retire, or we can buy it now and start working it off because we're going to put it on Airbnb. Be prepared that you're going to have to register it, you're going to have to pay tax on it, and you're going to have somebody to meet the guests, to sign them in, to check them in, to check a document. Yes, that's what you're going to have to do. And so if you're one of the people, and there are lots of people doing this, and you can understand they can't be there all the time, or they have a 5-year plan to come and buy a house in Italy or an apartment in Italy, and then to put it on Airbnb or Booking, whichever one you want to choose, for the rest of the year until they can come and physically live here. Now, if you're coming on an elective visa or some kind of visa, you have to physically be here. But if you have Italian citizenship, you can come and go as you please. You can be here for 2 months, be away for 8 months, do what you like. And there are lots and lots of people who have dual citizenship and decided to come and invest in Italy, and maybe bought 4 or 5 properties, and they farm them out to Airbnb, and maybe they have a manager who manages them, or maybe they mostly just use lockboxes and a cleaner who comes in once a week. So if you're one of those categories, you need to seriously look at my post. I'll put it up there on buying a property in Italy in 2025 and all the things you need to consider. I don't only cover Airbnb in that post. I cover what the market's doing in terms of property. But if you're one of the people wanting to invest or have invested recently and looking to maybe, profit from your investment, this post is really for you. Okay, let me see what's being said. Airbnb in Australia works marvelously. Yeah, okay. I did read that, Sarah. I think different countries have different scenarios, but certainly in terms of the lockbox, I think also mass tourism that's upcoming, as they mentioned, for the 2025 has changed things quite a bit. And also, you can understand why people bought 5 properties and thought, well, I'm going to get my investment back because I'm going to rent this out on Airbnb and all's going to be well. Property in Italy needs really to be looked at. I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. If you're thinking of relocating to Italy because you want to retire here, or you're a single person and you just have always dreamed of living in Italy, and you're not retiring, but you have independent means, so effectively you're early retiring or whatever, or you just want to come and spend a year here. What I want to say is, please rent. Don't jump in and fall prey to all the €1 house schemes and the living in certain village schemes where you can buy a very cheap property and then you have to renovate it. There's lots of lots of pitfalls in this. In terms of registering the property, how long it takes, the report you have to do on what the property is worth, what it will cost you to renovate it, in terms of finding people who perhaps you can't communicate with very well because you can't speak Italian, and you're going to get ripped off all the way along the line. I listen to stories every day of people who tell me of the sad story of what happened to them with their property in Italy. And many people leave Italy broken and bankrupt for this reason. So please don't be one of these people. I love the adventure. I came to Italy 20 years ago. I didn't understand the language. Now I speak fluently, obviously. But don't be tempted. I'll just come and buy a property in Italy, and then each year when I come out, I'll renovate a little bit, and then I'll be able to sell it. I'll make a huge profit. No, it's very unlikely. It's highly unlikely unless you win the lottery, which is what this is comparable to, that you find the perfect little house in the perfect little town which has good services. People often say to me, and this, by the way, is going to be my next week's discussion on medical care in Italy and what you need to watch out for. So, number one, if you've decided that you bought into this really cute little village, and there's some gorgeous little villages in Italy, let's be honest, but you haven't researched the services. What are services? The municipality there. Is there a local doctor that you are going to be able to join up to? Having a local doctor is one thing. He probably has a full slate of list. Oh, what is happening with my hair? I've literally made it stand up in a tower. So you may not be able to sign up to that local doctor. Many cities in the south of Italy don't actually have a functioning hospital. They share with 3 other towns or 3 other cities, and you'll never know this. You'll never know this as a tourist and as a non-local, because it may be being discussed all around you, but you wouldn't know because you can't speak the language. So all of these things are hidden from you. So buyer beware. Try to rent. I always say this: rent for 6 months, rent for a year. You could always ask. So here's a little tip I'm going to give you. Let's say you've been to Italy a couple of times and you've stayed in an Airbnb and you've fallen in love and you've chosen the city that you want to live in. I don't know, name a city that you love, Rome, and you've stayed in this Airbnb a bit whenever you could get a booking. There's nothing to stop you, because more and more Italian owners of Airbnb are getting fed up with a headache, and they're looking at going back to long-term renting. And one of the reasons why the government and different municipalities across Italy are anti-Airbnb is that it takes away from the long-term rental market. That deeply affects locals who now can't afford a rent, or even if they could afford it, there's just no availability because everything's being rented out on a short-term basis, which is nice for the owners because if they change their mind, they can just come back and live there. And in the meantime, they're earning lots of money on Airbnb and booking or whatever. But there are lots of European, Italian, French, Spanish owners who are starting to realize they'd like to go back to long-term booking, long-term leases, should I say. And so one of the things you could do, if you're coming on an elective visa and you need to find a rental agreement, or you're just coming for, I don't know, a year because you're on a sabbatical and you really would like a long-term lease, you can approach, because you usually have a contact number. I certainly usually have a contact number of the owner on Booking or Airbnb once you've actually paid and booked. And you can apply, you can ask them. I mean, obviously they have to, if you can't communicate with them at all, that's an issue. You'd have to ask in Italian, but a lot of them speak English, or some of them speak English. You could ask, would you be open to me renting this apartment from you for 6 months or a year. And they might just say yes. This is a possibility because, as I've mentioned, quite a lot of people who've been on Airbnb for 10 or 15 years are getting fed up with the taxes involved, with the headache involved, and maybe they would just like to peacefully rent out their apartment on a 3-year basis or 1-year basis, whatever. And the rent just comes in automatically, and they don't have to clean and keep upkeeping the apartment in a decent state. So that's a really good $1 million tip for you. If you're thinking of coming to Italy on a residence visa, or you're coming to spend a year here and you have an Italian citizenship, so you're not obligated to do the 30-day Schengen, shuffle where you can only be here for 3 months. Let's say you want to stay for a longer period. You can actually say, would you consider renting us the apartment for a year and see how it goes? And then you can negotiate. As I say, if you can't speak the language and they can't speak English, you're going to have to get some help, and I'm sure you can. Okay, so that's the discussion we've had. Okay. Won't the overseas owners just ask the people that clean and maintain the apartments to meet the guests, and hence a pointless change? Yes, that is a possibility, but it still means that they have to pay a manager or a cleaner. And as I mentioned, Sarah, people arrive at 3 o'clock in the morning because their flight was delayed, or they took a cheaper flight because it was halfway through the night if it's closer from UK or Ireland or wherever. And so, these people are not permanent employees of theirs. They come in, they clean the apartment, and they go home. So they're not managers where they're living in the building and they can just turn up and sign the guests in. Quite often they're cleaners. They come for a few hours. They get the key out of the lockbox, as I mentioned. They put the key back in the lockbox, close the code, and then the client comes whenever they like. That was the convenience of it. And these people are paid less than €10 an hour to clean. They are not a manager who's going to sit and hang around waiting. And then, of course, there has to be phone contact, because if the person is stuck at the airport and they said they were coming at 9 o'clock and now they're only coming at, 1 o'clock in the morning, this cleaner has to have her cell phone connected to these clients. So it's vastly more complicated, more than them just sitting around and waiting. They may live in another village, another town. So it's not so easy to find someone to sign in for you if you're the owner. Anyway, thanks for the question. Valuable question. Okay, so if you're going to watch this back later, this is a part of a series I've been doing on buying property in Italy in 2025, the reasons why not, the reasons why yes, what you need to watch out for. This is another part of that Airbnb and whether it's worth doing. Okay. And if you were one of the people who were thinking that this would make your property investment more doable, you need to consider these options. So, as usual, it's always lovely to see you. Thanks for joining. And when you watch this back, won't you leave me a comment down in the comment section down there? I promised I would hook up in the description box the law in Italy, the Airbnb situation on paying tax on Airbnb, and the requirement for the CIN number to be a registered Airbnb person. So yeah. So the lockboxes are the latest development in a series of crackdowns by the Italian fiscal police on what you can and can't do. And you're going to have to pay that 21% withholding tax. That's unavoidable. And this is the exact motivation I'm talking about. This and the need to have a host check you in as to why people might revert back to renting out their apartments on a longer term deal, which is good for the local population and good for you if you're thinking of coming to Italy for a longer period. So hope this has been useful for you. The year has started well here. It was a beautiful day today. I went for a gorgeous walk. The snow on the mountains, the lake looked absolutely beautiful. Sunny day. It was about minimum, I don't know, 2 degrees. It's not cold at all, and maximum about 12 or 15, which is lovely in the sun. And yes, and the year has started. And so I'm going to be covering mostly stuff on property and relocating stuff as usual. And yeah, if you haven't signed up yet, please do. And look forward to you on the next one. And thank you so much for joining and watching. See you on the next one from Amanda here in Italy. Bye. Leave me your questions down there in the comments and check the description box. All the information you need is in the description box, and I'll hook up the other videos up there. See you soon. Bye. Bye. Nice to see you.